On February the 20th, 1963, the Beatles posed for the picture which would become their debut album cover. In this video, we'll tell you the fascinating story, not just of this photo, but of the photographer who took it, and how it became lost forever. We'll also uncover secrets about the company that manufactured not just this, but all of the Beatles UK album covers. I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and welcome to the story of the Please Please Me album cover. With recording for the album completed, the next step was not only to name it, but to shoot the cover for it. EMI were notoriously tight when it came to spending money on the production of its album sleeves, and were loath to spend more than £50 per cover. Cheap and cheerful was the order of the day, which normally involved a cheesy photo of the artist, perhaps accompanied by a couple of cheap props. Or, if you were unlucky, you were replaced by a pretty lady, or unluckier still, just a stock photo. George Martin's initial idea was to call the album Off the Beatle Track, and have the Beatles photographed outside the insect house at London Zoo. He'd already employed a similar idea back in 1961, on Flanders and Swan's album of songs and verses about animals, called The Bestiary of Flanders and Swan. The front cover of that album showed the duo staring down the mouth of an elephant, with a giraffe nibbling the top of Michael Flanders' head on the back. Okay, the Beatles were not a comedy act, but Martin already recognised and wanted to exploit their personalities and sense of humour. Although the name The Beatles sounds normal to us today, you have to remember just how unusual it was back then. A lot of people thought it sounded plain creepy, and it was something they were constantly being asked about in their early interviews. In the end, the idea of associating the zoo with a scruffy pop group was too much for the suits at the Zoological Society, and George Martin's request was denied. So, it was back to the drawing board. George Martin also shelved the Off the Beatle Track title idea, but revived it for his own album in 1964. At that time, EMI had a pool of talented photographers who they could call on for a specific job, and the one they selected to work with the Beatles came with a proven track record of success. Welsh photographer Angus MacBean, actually pronounced McBain, had cut his teeth in West End theatres in the early 1930s. Like any good portrait photographer, his job was to make his subjects look good, and it was a task he excelled in, and his reputation soared amongst the theatre crowd, and his services became much in demand. His experiments with surrealism were especially admired. After the war, he relocated to a studio in Covent Garden, and for the rest of that decade and into the 1950s, he became the official photographer for productions at Stratford-upon-Avon, the Royal Opera House, Sadler's Wells, Glyndebourne, and the London Old Vic. There are few famous people from that era who appeared on stage whom he didn't photograph, with Vivian Leigh being his favourite. But by the end of the 1950s, the arts and entertainment world were changing. The increase in the popularity of television had led to a drop-off in the popularity of the theatre, and hence his services. But when one door closes, another one opens. And noticing the boom in the record industry, MacBain took an "if you can't beat them, join them" attitude and offered his services to EMI. Now, some of his early commissions, like these, were pretty forgettable. But his talent and skill as a portrait photographer were used to greater effect on Cliff Richard's first two albums. He even managed to add some artistic effect in the cover for Cliff's third album, Me and My Shadows. However, this shot for comedian Spike Milligan's 1961 album, Milligan Preserved, was one of his best. By recreating one of his most memorable surrealist works from the 1930s, MacBain perfectly captured not just the spirit of the album, but the character and personality of the artist himself, and it was hoped he could do the same with the Beatles. MacBain's first meeting with the Beatles occurred on January the 14th, 1963, at his studio at 53 to 55 Endell Street in London. The group had travelled down the day before from Birmingham after their appearance on the TV show Thank Your Lucky Stars, for what was to be their biggest and most important photo session of their career so far. The most famous shot taken that day can be seen on the Beatles' Hits EP, and more notably on the VJ album introducing the Beatles, where the image was flipped. The session was also plundered in 1982 for the picture sleeve of the 20th anniversary issue of Love Me Do, and again in 1983 for the reissue of the Please Please Me single. But as professional as these pictures were, nobody was happy with them. The Beatles themselves looked ill at ease, bored, and just plain tired. McBain's failure to capture anything of their personalities at this session led to another session being arranged the following week on January the 21st, but this time the location was at EMI House in Manchester Square. On January the 20th, after finishing their 272nd appearance at the Cavern, the Beatles got ready to leave for London. But there was a problem. Neil Aspinall had fallen ill and was unable to drive them down to London for the session. But as luck would have it, Brian Epstein bumped into the Cavern's doorman, Mal Evans, on the stairs and asked him if he would drive the Beatles to London. And so began a partnership that would continue until the Beatles' final days. So after dinner that evening, Mal drove them in the van, dodgy headlights and all, the 70-odd miles to London. The group then spent the night at the Hotel Cavendish in Gower Street and was chauffeured by Mal the next morning to George Martin's office at EMI House. This office-based session produced a series of shots of the Beatles standing in front of some Venetian blinds. One of the shots made it onto one of their early Parlophone publicity cards, and also onto Capitol's planned but never released Leave My Kitten Alone single in January 1985. Although a more relaxed and cheerful looking set of photos, this clearly wasn't album cover material, so a third session was booked for February the 20th, just 4 weeks before the album's release. Built in 1960, EMI House was an imposing modernist office block building. McBain later recalled arriving there on the morning of February the 20th and said, quote, "As I went into the door, I was in the staircase well, and someone looked over the banister. I asked if the boys were in the building, and the answer was yes. Well, I said, get them to look over, and I'll take them from here." Unaware of what situation would be facing him on the shoot, McBain had arrived with nothing more than his trusty portrait lens. This made the task of shooting in the poorly lit stairwell without a flash difficult to say the least, and a long way from ideal for a perfectionist like McBain. After initially trying something further up, the Beatles lined up on the first floor balcony. In order to get exactly the shot he wanted, McBain had to lie flat on his back in the entrance on the mat. His frustration and no doubt discomfort was made clear when, after just a handful of shots, he simply said, "That'll do," and that was that. This similar image shows British bandleader Joe Loss in exactly the same location just over a year earlier, on October the 12th, 1961. But it was not taken by McBain, nor was it ever used on an album cover. McBain's lack of enthusiasm must have been clear, and although again satisfactory, George Martin still didn't feel they captured the essence of the Beatles' personalities. So yet another photo shoot was arranged, but this time without McBain. March the 5th, 1963 was a busy day for the Beatles. Having driven overnight to London from a gig the night before at the Plaza Ballroom in St Helens, Lancashire, they rendezvoused with George Martin, Dick James and EMI staff photographer John Dove in front of EMI House. After a quick change into their suits inside EMI, they posed at the first location, a spiral staircase next to the building. They then took a 10-minute walk to nearby Montague Place, where they larked about with John's glasses and a parking meter. It was then swiftly on to Abbey Road for the recording session which would yield the From Me to You single. But just before they went in, they tried out some wacky poses on the steps in front of the building. 4 days later, on March the 9th, the Beatles began their tour with Chris Montez. The programme for that tour included a rough mock-up of the Please Please Me album cover. So, assuming the programmes would have been printed at least a week before the tour began, the decision to use McBain's balcony photos must have been made in advance of the March the 5th session. In the end, 3 of McBain's photos from the balcony session ended up being used on Beatles records. One, of course, for the album cover itself, then another slightly different one on the Beatles' No. 1 EP in November 1963, and, of course, another one for the Red and the Blue albums. Of course, McBain and the Beatles returned to the same location 6 years later to shoot the cover shot for their proposed Get Back album. Their first attempt on May the 7th, 1969, had to be aborted because a new part had been added to the lobby area, making it impossible for McBain to get exactly the same angle. After that session, EMI promised to remove the offending structure and invited them all to return the following week. That second session took place on May the 13th, and whilst waiting for Ringo to arrive, a fascinated John came and lay down next to McBain to see exactly how it looked from on the ground. With the cancellation of the Get Back album, the photos went unused for 4 years, until one appeared on the Red and the Blue albums in 1973. It was also used as it was originally intended for the Glyn Johns mix of the Get Back album in the recent Let It Be box set. In later years, the staircase became the location to be photographed in, but few were given permission to do so. However, those with enough bravado, like the Sex Pistols and Blur, managed to pull it off. So what happened to that famous balcony railing? Well, when EMI left Manchester Square in 1999, they took the stairwell railing, complete with the glass, with them to their new offices in Brook Green, Hammersmith in London, where it was installed in the first floor cafe. In 2009, EMI moved yet again, and the railing was mounted in their reception area at Wrights Lane off Kensington High Street. That location today is the home of the Warner Music Group, although it's thought that Paul McCartney now owns the handrail and keeps it in his Hog Hill Mill studio in Sussex. Now, as tradition demanded, the album sleeve also carried sleeve notes on the rear panel, which in this case were written by their press officer, Tony Barrow. Something else which was seen on all of the UK Beatles albums from 1963 to 1966 was Emitex. But what exactly was that? Emitex was EMI's own brand of record cleaning cloth, and here it is. Inside this small, crinkly packet was a piece of very thin cloth, which would have been impregnated with isopropyl alcohol, which has long since evaporated from this example. If you want to find out more about cleaning vintage vinyl, check out our dedicated video on that, a link to which is in the description. But there was another name which appeared on UK Beatles albums more often than Tony Barrow and Emitex put together. Although such a well-known name for any collector, not just of the Beatles albums, but for most others in the 60s and 70s, little is known about this highly successful family-run British company. But before we go into that, let's have a look at how the very first covers of Please Please Me were made. The earliest covers for this album were made by a company called Ernest J. Day. They were a rather old-school printing company and made beautiful but fragile covers. And by taking one apart, we can see exactly how it was constructed. Their covers consisted of a single piece of card folded down the centre, which would form the spine. A horizontal cut was then made towards the upper and lower edges of the right panel, with a slight crescent midway along. Like American covers, these were made using separately printed slicks, which would then be pasted onto the formed card. But like the American covers, it was the seams which were the weak point, as these were only held together by the thin paper of the slicks. Good-looking as they were, they certainly weren't built to withstand the kind of treatment doled out by excited teenagers, and many fell apart and ended up being repaired by any means necessary. But Garrod and Lofthouse had different ideas. But who exactly were Garrod and Lofthouse? Unfortunately, for a company which was so large for so long, their archive does not appear to have survived. Nevertheless, we've managed to find out some details about this company which we're delighted to share with you in this video. Norman John Garrod was born in July 1924 and had served in the RAF in the war, during which he met his wife Jane. They were married in 1945, after which Norman Garrod studied at the London College of Printing, where he proved himself to be a talented student. However, talent doesn't pay the bills, and his dream of setting up his own printing company was as far away as the 31st of June. But his talent didn't go unnoticed, and sometime in the early 1950s, he became acquainted with an aristocratic gentleman named James Lofthouse, or Jim to his friends, and he offered to put up the money to start a company. And thus, in October 1952, the company Garrod Lofthouse was born. Jim Lofthouse's financial investment was to be his sole contribution to the company, and his name was kept in the company trading name only as a mark of gratitude. Garrod's true partner in the business was his wife, Jane. She was, without doubt, a key player in the success of the company. As well as being instrumental in helping him set up the company, she acted as company secretary for many years, before becoming a director in 1964. The company's manufacturing plant was based in Caterham in Surrey. However, this original business card from their general manager, Bernard L. Gardner, shows their London head office in 6 Langley Street. Garrod was a talented inventor and innovator, and came up with a new idea to produce record sleeves cheaper and more efficiently than companies like Ernest J. Day. Traditionally, the process of printing record sleeves involved colour-printed items being put through the print machine 4 times. This 4-colour process involved applying the colours separately, starting with black, followed by the rest of the process colours in order. Now, Garrod saw that savings could be made in the manufacture of record sleeves if the front of the cover was printed in colour, but the back could be printed on a separate piece of card in black and white only. As well as making the cover more durable, this manufacturing method reduced print costs by a massive 37.5%. Garrod had filed a UK patent for his 2-piece flipback cover in December 1958. He then sold it to EMI, offering them a significant saving against their competitors. In return, EMI guaranteed that Garrod Lofthouse would print all EMI record sleeves. Decca had a similar close shop with their sleeve manufacturers, and as the 60s wore on, they found that they weren't able to meet the Rolling Stones' design demands and asked Garrod Lofthouse for help. Garrod Lofthouse then had to seek special dispensation from EMI to allow them to print sleeves for Beggar's Banquet in 1968 and the octagonal Through the Past Darkly in 1969. Also, they were the only company in the country which had the capability of producing the Sticky Fingers album with its famous zip. Of course, with success came ambition, and over time, Garrod Lofthouse purchased other similar companies in its field, including Ernest J. Day. By 1978, the company had 1,000 employees and 6 offices all over the country. In addition to their head office in the west of London, there were 2 in Surrey and Sussex and their northern office in Manchester. At one point later on, they owned 14 companies, not just in the UK, but in France and Italy too. But from that point on, things began to change, and not in a good way. Firstly, Garrod's wife Jane died in 1978, and this was followed by the rise in the popularity of the cassette, which by the mid-1980s was outselling vinyl in the UK. But it was the emergence of the CD as the dominant format in music retail which was the final nail in the coffin, and the company went into liquidation in April 1988. The earliest Please Please Me covers carry one tiny indicator which marks them out as being one of the very first produced, and involves our old friend Angus MacBain and his credit in the lower front left corner. On all first gold label pressings, and most of the first 2 variations of the black and yellow label, this credit was positioned so that the P in the word photo was aligned at the end of the letter S, beneath the word songs. On later sleeves, that was shifted slightly to the left, so that the P now resided just below the letter G. As with other EMI releases, the size and shape of the front mono stereo indicator changed during the 1960s. In 1963, it was big and bold, whereafter it was reduced to a mid-size variation in 1964, then to a small size in 1965, and removed completely in 1970. Unfortunately, the story of this cover has a rather tragic postscript. In January 2001, EMI were working on a project to transfer their priceless photographic archive from their offices in Brook Green to their main company archives. On one particular day, 3 boxes of priceless negatives, photos and transparencies, which included all of Angus MacBain's Please Please Me shots, had been stacked in the office with a note attached saying, "Not rubbish, do not remove." However, a cleaner working for a company called Crystal Services either ignored or just didn't see the note and threw all 3 boxes into a waste compactor, where they were duly crushed. In 2007, EMI and Apple sued Crystal for £700,000 on multiple counts of negligence. I don't know if they actually won their claim for damages, but it was a truly devastating loss. So if or when Apple issues a Please Please Me box set, don't expect the cover quality to be up to much. If you'd like to find out more fascinating stories about the Beatles album covers, I'll put a link in the description to videos we've made about them on this channel. There's a lot of anniversaries coming up for Beatles records in the coming weeks, and we'll be covering them all on this channel. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on those. Finally, I'd like to say a massive thank you to everyone who sent me get well messages after my recent bout of COVID. I'm truly blessed to have such a wonderful community of viewers, and I'm grateful for each and every one of you. I hope you'll join me next week for one of those anniversary videos. But in the meantime, I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.